Okay, and welcome everybody to this monthly meeting of ICODR members. And we move on month to month, and we have a very a different and exciting and interesting presentation by Bob Bergman here. Colin will introduce Bob in more detail, but he comes from the decision science. So if any of you have ever had any problems making decisions, I think like Amir, choosing the shirt each time, that's a big decision. Bob's got a way of helping out on that. And last time I sort of introduced a little item called news, and I think it'd be useful for all members to listen to anything that's hot off the presses to do with technology and dispute resolution and ODR. I'll just mention three things, and if anybody's got anything else to share, because there's so much beginning to happen now, please perhaps put it in the chat, and perhaps if we've got time at the end, maybe we can talk about it. Three things. First of all, Zabinic Labelle, one of our colleagues, fellows at NCTDR, is putting on an ODR track at the end of October. I haven't got the precise date just yet. It's just going to be a 4-hour session. It's focused on standards for training and education in ODR and technology and dispute resolution. I've just heard that an interesting development in Europe by the Council of Europe, not to be confused with that other body, the European Union. This is a much bigger organization that has 47 member states throughout Europe, including Russia. I remember giving a talk to them when they were looking into evidence of ODR as whether it was a threat to human rights. And they came to the view and issued a resolution to say it wasn't, quite the opposite. It helped people gain access to justice. And they encourage all 47 member states to take steps to promote the development and use of ODR. They're now forming the European Cyber Justice Network, which will be launching in November, I think. Again, no date just yet set, but I will try and get out as much more information on that. But it's involving all member states, and they're particularly looking at cyber justice from the perspective of human rights. So it'll be quite interesting. Finally, I'm just going to be giving a talk for Mediators Beyond Borders International tomorrow, which is going to be quite a detailed walkthrough with the Smart Settle team. They're going to be showing in detail their e-negotiation products, One and Infinity. So that's all the news that I've got to say. If anyone's got anything else to add, perhaps if you could just put it in the chat. And can I hand over now to Colin to introduce our special guest?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Graham. Yeah, and I am eager to see everybody's thoughts in the chat. So please don't hesitate to post questions, comments. A lot of the richest content comes out in the chat. But I'm very happy to introduce my friend Bob Bergman, our presenter for today. He's the Chief Decision Officer at Next Level Mediation. Bob was at Intel for many, many years. And I think he told me he started this project as a hobby alongside his son, who is a computer scientist. But Bob has 45 years experience in decision sciences, software engineering, business strategy simulation, scenario planning, system dynamics modeling, and market research. So he's an expert in applying quantitative decision methodologies to improve many kinds of negotiations and strategic business decisions. So he has a really unique perspective on mediation. I remember when I first took decision science back when I was in grad school, and they taught me how to do decision trees and things like that. And I thought, you know what, this is kind of like dispute resolution. But we don't really think about, when we think about our facilitative mediation models, we don't often think about those as decision-making processes. And I think the reason why the Next Level Mediation platform is revolutionary, not evolutionary, is because it does embrace a lot of the wisdom and expertise that Bob has gleaned over his 45 years of professional experience and put it into software and lay out those tools in front of users. So I'm really excited about this session today. And I want to thank you, Bob, for taking the time. And I think this is going to be a really great conversation. So with that, why don't I hand it over to you, Bob, to kick us off?
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me clearly?
We can. Thumbs up.
Okay. Well, first, let me thank Colin and Graham for inviting me to talk today. We have a lot to cover, so in a very relatively short period of time, considering the functionality of the system we developed. So at times it'll feel like drinking from a fire hydrant. but don't worry, the presentation will be available, and I'm available at any time to do one-on-one kind of demonstrations for more clarity. So let's start. I mean, one of the interesting problems is that disputes generate a lot of emotion. And you can imagine that the first reaction your brain has is from the reptilian complex, because this is the oldest part of your brain. And it's basically fight or flight, self-preservation. And there's very little communication with the neocortex, which is where you make logical decisions. And so by the time disputing parties kind of sit down with a neutral to resolve a conflict, emotions tend to be running pretty high, reason can be in short supply, and clients are often stuck in what we call child logic. And so this is, no matter how intelligent or whatever age you are, people, and because of the reptilian complex, you seem to regress first to this area of your brain. And because of that, you get things like, I deserve justice. I want what I want. Life should be fair. Every good deed deserves reward. Sure. But when you're a child, that works. When you're an adult in this current environment, it becomes very difficult to maintain that. And so part of the problem is getting through that cloud of emotion to understand what people really want. I mean, and what they need, as opposed to, let's say, their emotional wants. So by the time, people are sitting down to start a mediation, there's really no priority of key objectives. There's usually an unrealistic set of litigation expectations, and then a normal anger and distrust of the opposing parties. So, when your emotions running high, your logic will be low, and this can lead to irrational decisions. Now, why are there so many poor decisions? Well, we, first of all, have defined dispute resolution as a multi-criteria decision between two or more parties that have essentially opposing agendas. And when this thought came to us, we said, okay, this makes sense. We can apply more decision analytical tools because people use decision support systems. And unfortunately, in today's world, there are no courses or instruction below the college level that teach people the fundamentals of decision making. So we learn this kind of important life skills solely by observation and trial and error. Unfortunately, our brains are kind of physically unable to analyze large quantities of data, and we wind up trying to make decisions with very little support. So humans tend to only be good at making decisions by comparing two things at a time. This is why, for example, when you go to your optometrist to get prescriptions for your glasses, they'll ask you, which one is clearer, this one or this one, or this one or this one? That's because we can, for terms of intensity purposes, humans can only compare two things logically. So people often make decisions involving dozens of factors without any real support tools. On top of that, we now live in a very complicated world. And because we tend to make or solve problems by trial and error, we tend to make lots of bad decisions. On top of that, we are now moving into what I call a stage of post-humanism, where we rely a lot on the device. Instead of learning mathematics and grammar and spelling, we depend on a device. And so humans are evolving to depend very highly on a device. We like to call these people phono sapiens. Okay, and this is a kind of a combination of humans and a device. And when we're making decisions that affect us personally, it's very difficult to remain objective and think clearly through the best solution. So in order to resolve the problem, we looked at conflict resolution as a system. And even if it's a small legal dispute or a dispute in human resources in a workplace, or it's the beginning of a conflict between nations, the dynamics are roughly the same. The diagram you're looking at is basically what we call causal loop diagram in system dynamics. And basically what it's showing you is that there is a motivation of a claimant or a plaintiff to win something. That causes a sense of injustice of the defendant or the other party, which causes the motivation of the other party to win, which causes a sense of injustice of the original claimant. So, end up in this positive feedback loop. Unfortunately, as the motivation to win goes up, the willingness to mediate goes down, and it becomes more and more difficult to make good decisions. So once we understood the dynamics of disputes, we looked at where we could supply tools. And so what increases the motivation to win is two things. One is kind of child logic or just human emotions. You can be biased a number of different ways. You can have confirmation bias, you can have optimism bias or pessimism bias. Whatever that bias is, it'll increase the motivation to win. What brings the motivation to win down is basically stress over time and the stress of possibly losing in litigation. So we decided to build some tools to give people a more realistic understanding of the outcomes of litigation, which I think, as Colin mentioned, were somewhat in the decision tree category. And then tools to help understand what people's real objectives are. And
Yes,
so,
dear. Okay.
yeah, and so the concept is basically to, with the help of a mediator or a neutral or an arbitrator, some forms of facilitator, along with a better understanding of what people really need as opposed to their emotional wants, and a better understanding of what the possible outcomes of litigation would be if you decide not to settle, you can get to a better decision for a person or clients that are in this process of mediation or dispute resolution. So the basic idea at a high level is to move people from child logic to critical thinking without really calling it critical thinking. And since the human brain can't be both highly emotional and quantitative at the same time, we use this kind of process of selective attention or pairwise comparison to get people to make more logical decisions and clarify their objectives. The benefit, of course, is that clients will make better objectives, mediators will better understand the priorities and real objectives, not the emotional wants of their clients, and will be able to better communicate litigation risk. So that's kind of the elevator pitch. You know, I've narrowed this down from like 50 slides to a few. And so there are some basic tools, the ability to create questionnaires, take notes, a library of assessment models for different kinds of disputes. Of course, you can create your own, and a library of risk analysis models that are geared to a variety of different disputes. So I think what I'll do is go into the demonstration, and then we hopefully will have plenty of time to answer questions, which I'm sure I have probably generated quite a few by now. So
yeah. Can I just mention that, please, everybody with the question, if you could just do a short cover on the chat, and we'll get round to. We should have plenty of time for at the end of your presentation, Bob.
Yes, I should. So right now I'm logged into the system as a mediator. I have a variety of tools at my disposal. If I go on. I have my own personal client directory, which could be companies or individual clients. I have a library of priority models, and we'll discuss them. And then we have the ability to create questionnaires. Of course, you can create your own models as well. And then a library of risk analysis models, which again, you can create your own or edit the ones that are already in the system. In addition to that, you have two modes of operation or two roles. You can be a consultant, which means you are either representing someone in a mediation or you're doing consulting, possibly just as an attorney, as an example, which means that there's only one side. You might have a group of people in that one side, but the idea is to get clarification among that one group of people. And if you're acting as a mediator, then you have two sides. Again, both sides can have groups, and there are possibly three or more. And then you're trying to get resolution between those groups. So as an example, just so you understand when they say priority model, what that really means. Here's an example of a simple model that's, are you ready for mediation? And a model in the system is just a hierarchy of objectives. And the idea is the system takes those objectives and creates a set of comparisons from the model. And then from those comparisons, which are quantitative, can actually calculate a priority of those objectives. So here's a simple one called ready for mediation. And the basic goal is to understand if you're ready for mediation. And the simple objectives are things like expressing your feelings, avoiding litigation, creating a mutually beneficial solution, understanding the true issues. And so when people prioritize this, you get a pretty good idea if they're ready. If their highest priority is just expressing their feelings and not really understanding issues, you could question whether they're really ready to mediate anything. And so we have models in a variety of categories. Just to give you an example, you can see contract disputes, construction, business, divorce, financial regulatory issues, personal injury, workplace disputes, and you can, of course, create your own categories. Today, to keep this somewhat relevant with the news, we're going to go through a make-believe dispute, and we're going to use two different models. One will be a cybersecurity insurance dispute model, which has the following kind of objectives, and I'll explain the dispute. As you can see, it's things like restoring digital assets, business interruption recovery, and of course notifying your users and the costs associated with that. And so, without further kind of explaining those details, let's look at this demonstration I set up. So I've created a mediation between two parties, party A and party B. The dispute is basically a cyber insurance claim dispute. That means party A claims that they were a victim of both a cyber breach and cyber insurance claim declination. And in particular, there was language in the contract, according to the insurance company, that limited ransomware extortion payments in the event that the insured did not update their software within 30 days of the vendor's required update. This actually turns out to be a common problem if you didn't read the fine print, or if you didn't communicate this minor thing to your IT department, you could have a major problem when trying to get paid. There are two parties, and you can see this is kind of the overview of the dispute. You can see it was set up with a virtual meeting. You put in the Zoom information. And you have two parties. Party A has accepted the terms, and I'll explain what that means. They've answered, looks like they've answered questionnaires that were set up. Now, I've done party A and I'll do party B during the demonstration, but to save time, I've already filled in stuff for party A. So a questionnaire was generated that was attached to the mediation. And you can see the answers that party A gave. The question was things like, did the security breach cause a major interruption of business? And party A says, yes, business was offline for 2 weeks. I lost $250,000. As a result of the breach, was there regulatory fines? No. Was the security breach a direct result of employee theft or loss of a memory stick? Questions like that. Have all affected parties been notified? Do you feel comfortable negotiating online? And so they filled out that questionnaire. And now as a mediator, you're reading the answers, so you have some idea of where party A is. On top of that, they have filled out this priority assessment, which was that model I showed you just previously of the different kinds of issues that party A has to deal with in terms of the cyber breach. And again, I'm trying to save some time. So you will take a look at the results of that and what gets, so the system takes that small model, for instance, and generates a set of questions, which is, okay, in terms of digital assets, prioritize financial recovery. So which is more important? Digital assets getting repaid for digital asset costs or business interruption costs? How much more important is it? Well, party A said this is 4 times more important, right? How much more important, is digital asset costs versus marketing customer costs? 2 times more important. And so what we're doing here is we're taking the client or the claimant in this case and making them be quantitative about what their priorities are. And by going back and forth, by doing just simple pairwise comparison, we can actually calculate when they're finished doing those things, their priorities. And so we see that in this case, party A, business interruption is clearly 60% of their worry. Forensic costs, notification costs, all these other things were much lower priority to them. But what this did was give us a rough idea of where they stand. Now, sometimes you'll see, for instance, now what we call consistency ratio. And what this means is that it's possible for people to be completely logically inconsistent, meaning not showing transitive logic. What that means is that if objective A is twice as important as objective B, and objective B is twice as important as objective C, well then A should be 4 times as important as C, and C should be 1/4 as important as A. And you will see sometimes, and let me just change the sensitivity of this a little bit for demonstration purposes. When you see things that are highlighted in this kind of reddish pink color, that means there's some kind of illogic going on. And it gives the mediator a chance to go back, talk to the claimant, or talk to one of the clients who answered the assessment and say, look, here's some areas where we're not quite logical. Let's go back and rethink this thing a little bit. And so it just gives you another avenue to see whether one, the client is being logical, and 2, whether they're, for instance, trying to game the system in some way. Okay, so this will give you the details of those priorities, and level of emotion, it's going to be optional to display this. But what this means is that when the mediator creates a small model, you can tag one of those or one or more of those objectives as being emotionally driven. For example, in a breach of contract, if one of those objectives, like punish the other side or collect punitive damages, was highlighted as emotional, depending on where the client ranked that, this would change the scale in terms of the level of emotion. And in some cases, you'll see that people are in the red zone, which means they're highly biased by emotion, anger, revenge, whatever that is. And it gives, again, a chance to go back and discuss it, understand a little better what's driving it. And since it's the mediator that labels in the system things are emotional or not, and the client doesn't know that until they do the analysis, it gives them a good idea of where they stand. So let's go back. So that's one side of the story. So let's go back now, and we see party B hasn't done anything yet. So I'm going to log out of this mediator's view, and I will be the insurance company, which in this case is party B. By the way, if it's not a legal dispute or hasn't gone to court system yet, then we don't label people as defendants and plaintiffs or claimants because it tends to exacerbate the issue. Just keep people as party A or party B. So now I see as party B, one of the clients I've logged in, I see where my Zoom meeting is, and then I have some questions to answer. Well, I'm not going to take up a lot of time answering all the questions, but let's just say the breach caused a major, and let's say from the insurance company, we'll say yes, but only 3 days. That's their opinion. And then the rest we'll leave for now. Again, this is just saving time. Okay. Now on top of that, we now see, okay, I have to answer these insurance questions or my insurance assessment. So what this, now put your mindset, I am the insurance company. And so it's asking me, okay, what's more important? Managing litigation costs or discouraging future lawsuits? No, maybe managing litigation costs. Twice as important to me. What's more important, managing litigation costs or avoiding bad faith? Well, this is a good customer. He's very big and very influential in the market. So I don't want a lot of social media blowback. So I'm going to say it's 4 times as important. I don't want bad faith. What's more important? Managing litigation costs or maintaining insured relation? I need to keep this guy as my customer. Discouraging future lawsuits or avoiding, I would just say avoiding bad faith again. Discouraging future law, maintaining the insured relation is very important to me. Maintaining this, these maybe this is only twice as important as that. But you see, it's making you think a different way. These are roughly kind of the same. And I'll complete this. So now I see that as the insurance company, my biggest concern is maintaining the insured relationship, avoiding bad faith, discouraging future lawsuits. So how do I use all of this information? So if I log back on as a mediator in this case, oh boy. So I'll open the mediation. And I'll see people have answered some questions. And I want to look at the assessment results. And now I can see side by side in this case that the main concern of my claimant is getting paid for the business interruption, which he said was about $250,000. So of course, there's arguments from the other side that wasn't the case, but the insurance defense priorities, basically the insurance company said, I am interested in keeping this relationship, and I'm not that interested in paying too much money, but that's okay. So I look at these and say, okay, maybe there is a place to negotiate. Now, you can also see the details, consistency ratio. And if you have, for example, multiple people in party A, you can, for instance, select any of the criteria, and you'll see how each of the parties rank that particular criteria. So you can see, for example, which ones are outliers and which ones all follow roughly in the same area, because then you can focus your attention in the group on those that are primarily outliers. So, and that works for this. So on top of all of this, in the party A, which we didn't go over, which we'll go over now, they, with their attorney, did this kind of analysis of the risks of going to court. Now, one thing I didn't go over, let's say before we go into this, the library of risk models. So let me just find the risks. Just to give you an example, we've done quite a few of these and have developed a number of risk models, everything from malpractice to financial regulatory issues. And these models basically look kind of like this. And this might be hard to see, but here's a model, for instance, for regulatory broker claim. This is where, you know, the investment went south and the claimant said, oh, you gave me the wrong information, or you didn't tell me about the risk, or, you know, of course, didn't complain when it was going up. And so these tend to be in arbitration most of the time. And so there are issues like, you know, is the arbitration panel sympathetic or not to the claimant? If so, was the investment suitable or not, and so forth. And you build the decision trees like this. You can build these yourself using this tool. You can take a look at how these are going to look to the user when you use the user interface. And of course, you can edit any of them as well. So typically, for a US trial, for instance, there's a default one, which I'm sure everybody's seen. And this is, let me make it a little bigger. You know, things like, okay, was there a dispositive motion? Was there a summary judgment or not? If there was a trial, was there, you know, a defendant kind of win, or did the plaintiff win? And basically, was there a low or medium award? And on top of that, if there any of these awards were given, what's the probability of collecting or not, right? And so this is kind of a standard model, but there are lots of different kinds of disputes. For instance, civil case in the UK court is a little different than US. And so you can see there are trials, maybe an expert witness or not, and things like that. So you can build these models, you can use the ones that exist, you can edit them to fit your particular situation. And so I'm going to go back real quick and look at the results of the one that was done by party A. So you see, basically, this was a contract dispute. And so you can see the tree on the right, possibly, it may not be big enough, but basically it's, okay, am I going to settle or am I going to litigate? If I'm going to litigate, there's a trial to determine whether it was a breach. There may or may not have been a breach. If there was a breach of the contract, was it material or not? And if it was either one of those, what are my high, medium awards? So that's a basically simple decision tree for a breach of contract. And the user interface, this is for the attorney or for the claimant if you want to fool around with it. You put in the amount of time you think that you're going to spend, let's say, in mediation in this case, what the cost might be, and what you think you could settle for. Again, you control what parameters are going to be collected at any one point in time. You can put in the time, let's say a trial might take, or the time until the trial. In this case, it's 5 months, what the cost is, what the probability that there's no breach. If there was a breach, if there was no breach, what's the probability that there was a high, medium, and low award? And if there was a defendant breach, again, the same information. And once you've completed that, you click on complete, and you'll get basically some things. So if you settle, you'll get, if you can settle for the 150,000, you'll essentially get 148,000, which is subtracting the cost. Then you can see the expected value of the monetary value of the settle path is 150,000. In the case of the trial path, the expected value is 70,000 going to trial. The bottom actually is 45,000 because you have to subtract the cost of getting that expected monetary value. And the Watner is you basically lost in the trial and you spent the 25,000. And based on the days you put in and the amount of time, this is going to be your result in 164 days. And then you can see, for instance, the spread of probability. So there's a 30% chance if you go to trial, you lose $27,000. There's a 14% chance you lose $2,000. So basically, there's a 44% chance you lose money if you go to trial. And then you can see the other spread of probabilities. So between understanding what the objectives, the real objectives are of the client, and a better understanding of the real risk, determining on the type of dispute, and again, you can create multiple models, you have a chance to now, you've collected enough information to try to negotiate a reasonable solution to the dispute. Now, in terms of, just one more quick thing, and then I'll open it up so we have plenty of time for answers. So whether or not clients decide to settle, you can give them information, probably information they didn't realize before, which is what their priorities were and what the risks are if you just click as the mediator to download the results, assuming the server wakes up. Let me just put that into downloads for now. Yeah, sure. So if we look at the PDF that gets generated, there's a usual disclaimer which says, do not use this as legal information. You know, there's lots of disclaimers about probabilities and things like that. Answers to the questions. These were your priorities. These were the kind of detailed priorities. Here's the inconsistency results. What was your level of emotion, which was low in this case? What's the risks? What's the settle amount? What's the expected monetary value of the bottom and the Watner? And kind of a distribution. And this will basically outline the probabilities, and you can decide whether you want to email this to your client or not. But even if they don't settle, they get some information that they probably didn't have before. So that's the quick demonstration. And so I will open it up. There's plenty of functionality like taking notes and things like that that I didn't go over, but I have, you know, you can always schedule time for a personal demonstration if you want to go over more details about how the system works. So I will open it up then to questions.
Thank you, Bob. Fascinating. And I could see so different. I love the way it gets the parties to focus from the get-go on the interests rather than the arguments at the core of the dispute. Who said what, when, who did what, when, what's the chance? I think that's got to be very helpful in doing that, particularly. Question really, just to clarify, do I take it, if you're using this as mediator, presumably all the answers are confidential to each party?
That's correct.
Or do you see any benefit in some sharing?
Yeah, so for example, the priorities that come out of the assessment, let's say of party A, are only available to party A and the mediator, not available to party B unless you want to make them available. The risk analysis model, which is maybe between you and your attorney or representative, is only available to party A unless they click a switch that says share it with the mediator. And so the system is defined as lots of different ways. So it's defined in terms of roles, whether you're a mediator, an attorney, participant, or consultant. And the menu items, for example, that show up on the left here are only depend on your role in the system and your role at the time. So you can be both a mediator, obviously, and a consultant. But if you're in the role of a consultant, you have one set of options. If you're in the role of a mediator, you have a different set of options. And when a client does a priority assessment, for example, that information is shared with his attorney only.
Right.
And so nothing is shared with the other party unless you explicitly grant that.
And sort of related to that, is it then the choice of the mediator whether to show the client exactly what we're looking at in the system, or merely use it to guide the way he gets information about interest from the parties, and then he feeds it in as a guide to himself as mediator? Is that optional? And if it's optional, do you have any views about which is preferable?
Our experience is it depends on the situation. I don't think there's a preference. I think a lot, the mediator can certainly, and it's advisable in a lot of times, to use this as just collecting information so that they can actually start a negotiation process and make the process more reasonable. They can also use the information by city going back to the party that did the assessment and saying, look, make sure this is the real priorities. These things might be a little inconsistent. You answered the questions this way. You said that business interruption was not that important, but in your priorities, you said it was important. So
yes.
How do we resolve this? And so there's resolution between the mediator and his client, and then there's resolution between the two different parties.
Okay, any questions from the floor? I'm just looking at.
Yeah, I think Anil has one.
Yeah, Bob, two things. One is an observation and then a question. I think, initially it seems very technical, but once the party starts filling up the pointers, I agree with Graham that it tends to focus the party's interest as opposed to their position. So it's an interesting exercise if parties are the ones filling it up as opposed to their counsel. And that leads me to the question, would you, if you're using this as a mediator, insist that the parties must fill it up themselves as opposed to their counsel filling it up? Would you insist on that?
Yes, I would actually. Yeah. It makes a lot more sense because you want to really understand what the party wants. Sometimes, the attorney can be a little self-serving. So yes. You want to avoid that. But of course, if it's a business-to-business dispute, the two parties might actually be attorneys anyway. So there won't be.
So I would rather have the parties themselves fill it up, because then while they're filling it up as they go along, they start realizing what is it they want to get out of the mediation, as opposed to I'm going in there for a fight and I want to take my positions and all of that. So instead of that, the kind of the process while you were describing it, it kind of like brings me down to a calmer level of I want to try and get this sorted out. I don't want to go pushing my position. I want to get my interest and sort it out. So it kind of helps them do that. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Bob, go on.
Okay. I don't, were there more?
There are lots more questions, but maybe I can inject one here too, Bob. I think this platform is fascinating. I think it's really interesting. And the thing that I like is it's a fusion of obviously the work that's happening in the ODR field and the mediation field, but it's also decision science and all of your expertise in that area. I think several of the comments that were made, and I do want to get some of the questions asked in the chat, but Katerina made the point, that she thought that this would work especially well for business clients. I think there is a sense that this is, as we say, decision science. This is sort of a rational way to model the choices and decisions that need to be made over the course of a negotiation or mediation process. And Graham, this is the way I feel about Smart Settle. I think, it needs to be the right kind of party, and it needs to be the right kind of dispute for the tool to really generate value. If you have an emotional, you talked about, sort of a child's orientation around these cases. If people have an emotional kind of I should get what I want orientation, and they come in and they're put into a process that's so sort of science-based and structures and models a lot of these questions, I could see somebody saying, they would just kind of knock all the pieces off the table and say, no, I want what I want. But I do think that in a business dispute, when you're talking about two rational parties that resolve a lot of disputes at the same time, I think a tool like this could be enormously valuable. And that PDF that you generate and send to the parties, I think could be incredibly revelatory and valuable to the parties in helping them think through the options that they have. So I think that we have to fit the forum to the fuss, and I'm not sold that this tool is appropriate for all kinds of disputes, but I am sold that for certain kinds of disputes, this tool could be absolutely revolutionary. And I'm interested in your thoughts, Bob, when you were building it. Were you thinking about a particular dispute type, or was your aspiration to build it for all kinds of disputes?
No, the idea was to build it for all kinds of disputes. Now, for instance, one of the first ones we did was a wrongful death dispute, right? It's not a business-to-business dispute, but the plaintiff was highly emotional, lost an uncle who was a main source of support in an airline crash, and came in wanting, an extremely large amount of money from the insurance company. Obviously, the insurance companies don't like to pay a lot of money, if any at all. And when it came right down to it, her actual highest priority was not the money, but it was not going through any more of the trial, any more emotional part of the trial, and she didn't want to sit through some more expert witnesses, and that was twice as important as the amount of money, as it turned out, right? And on the insurance company side, they didn't want bad faith. Of course, they didn't want to pay a lot of money, but it turned out as long as they honored the dead and did some other changes on their approach, she was happy taking less money, okay? And so we wouldn't have known that unless we forced her to actually prioritize her feelings in terms of, money, going through more trials, honoring the dead, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. There's a question on the chat from Richard. Experience makes you think perceptions of history must be addressed prior to quantifying the risk of non-resolution. Richard, I presume you're referring to the history of the dispute. Wonder how the decision tree might work with this aspect of the process. Bob?
Yes, I mean, you can build, it's interesting that the decision tree, because you can keep going back and changing, put in whatever values you want, you might have already had sunk costs. You might be past, let's say, some preliminary part of the trial and spent a fair amount of money, so you can obviously put that in. But for instance, if the evidence presented during the trial changes, that might change your probability of an outcome. So you would just go change the probability of the outcome, and you'd see the new partner, whatnot. So even at different stages of the litigation process, you can decide based on the information to settle or not. It's still a form of mediation. It's just postponed mediation until you've spent more money.
Okay.
Graham, if you don't mind, Katharina pinged me and she said she had a comment she wanted to make because I raised her question a second ago. So Katharina, do you want to raise your point?
Yes, thank you, Colin. So I was the one who said that I have doubts about this working in cases where private individuals are involved. You gave that example of the person where it was a wrongful death suit and they really didn't want to go through the emotional turmoil of a trial. But in other cases, I think people's emotional needs are just as important for a settlement as people's rational needs. I don't share your premise that the one is superior than the other. I think both need some minimum. And I want to give a specific example that I know of in an accident case. A mediator friend of mine caused an accident that caused personal injury to a person that the value exceeded her maximum coverage. So they were stuck and she wanted to go to mediation against the insurance attorney's wishes, and she did. And because she wanted to use her empathy skill to let the other person know how bad she felt about how this impacted that person's life. So she listened to all of that, gave all her empathy, and they settled for the maximum coverage of the insurance.
Yes, sure. I mean, I would never say there's 100% certainty in anything. And yes, there are cases where, for sure, but at the end of the day, the insurance company had to agree as well, right? So they were making some kind of logical decision, right? They weren't making an emotional decision. The plaintiff drove it to mediation because of an emotional need, but the insurance company, I'm sure, did not decide based on
the defendant drove it to mediation because she was a mediator and thought that would be more effective.
Okay. Well, that might be the case. I'm sure it's not, like I said, not 100% of all cases are gonna use this effectively. I'd be foolish to make that claim, but that's a good example of where it might not work, or it might lead you to a different solution.
Okay, let me just put a couple more that's on the chat. And if anyone just wants to speak with a question, if they could just click the reactions and raise your hand so you come to the top of the list. We know who it is. Chet asked Bob, do you find that parties in council resist objectively realistic probability estimates? And if so, does that skew the resulting numbers? And I think importantly, how do you deal with that? Presumably it does, but how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it works both ways. Look, we know humans aren't 100% rational. That's why they call it bounded rationality. And you can be biased by a lot of different things, but two of the more obvious biases are optimism and pessimism. And optimism is a bias, and which would increase, your probability, put down your probability of success. But it's okay to be an optimistic person. It's not necessarily okay to make an optimistic decision, because that's a decision based on your ego. It says, independent of the probability of success, it's going to work for me. And so people, with sometimes the encouragement of an attorney, might put in different probabilities, and they can try to put these out. But what we found is that when attorneys are forced to agree and say, okay, I think there's a 60% chance of this, right? They're a little more cautious about how they think it through, and not just standing up and claiming, yeah, we're going to win 100% of the time, right? So,
yeah. Well, that just reflects, because we know the most important part of mediation is not towards the end where you're just trying to get the parties to go that little further. It's right at the beginning to get the parties fully involved and wanting you to work and to help them to succeed.
Right.
No different. I can see that. Well, yes. So Jeff asked similarly, if the clients of the council won't let the clients fill out the interest forms, then what? Can you still use the platform? And what does it look like?
Well, the attorneys share the same data as their clients. So if a client's filling something out, the attorney has access to the same information. They have to decide between themselves what they'll agree to.
So the clients can actually click through and log it themselves anyway, because the question was if the lawyers told them not to. Oh, okay. Can you add steps? Yeah, this is one of my questions. I presume you can edit up these questions, can you, or steps? Question.
Yes, of course. You
can add others that you want that's more relevant to.
Yeah, when you're creating models, let me just. You can create your own models. If you find a model, there's about 50 or 60. I just filtered this out a little bit, but of course you can filter the models. But basically, if you find a model that's close to the thing you're doing, all you need to do is clone it, and then you can edit it. Okay,
good. Jeff wants to ask a question.
Sure, Jeff.
I appreciate the breadth and the depth of this platform. I've seen nothing like it, and I think it's has many areas of utility. And yet, I work with a lot of lawyers who don't trust each other by virtue of the tribe, plaintiff defense bar. I think we all know what we're talking about. So I guess what I was asking in my first question is that there may be reluctance to put information into a platform that for a number of reasons. First of all, they may not want me to know really what their interests are because they're just economically driven. They may not want the other side to have any access to sensitive information. So if they're putting it into a central database, they're not really sure who will have access to it. So I throw that stuff out there, and maybe that's when you have those types of personalities, maybe it's just get ready for a headbanging affair. Whereas when you have folks who are a little bit more relationally oriented, this platform might be very helpful.
Yeah, so of course the mediator should know who the clients really are. So when you create a mediation, and you can decide whether or not you're going to add a risk model or not. Okay, so if you feel like clients are not going to make it very useful, or their attorneys aren't going to want to fill it out, fine. There is a switch when you log in, for instance, as let me show you. Sign out for a second. So when I logged in as party A, somewhere. It's a good question. So when I log in as party, and we've gone through this a number of times. So when I've finished filling out the forms, when I fill this out, I can just change this switch. It says I'm sharing the information with the mediator or not, in which case this risk assessment model basically stays between the attorney and his client. That's it. And it's not shared at all. And certainly not shared with the other party. The other party can have their own risk model, and then it's up, And if you look at the range between, what's settled in the BOTNA and what you can settle for in the BOTNA and the other parties, you have two overlapping ranges where there's a zone that you might be able to negotiate some reasonable solution. But in terms of sharing, you don't have to share this information with, especially the risk model, with the mediator if you feel it's proprietary or client confidential information.
But at the very least, it helps clients and lawyers think through their strategy, as we know that there's sometimes very little of that. And at least this platform will help put some structure around that.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. And finally, because we're running, I think, out of time, just coming up to the hour, Thomas has just, well, has come in with 3 questions. But the first one is, what if the platform, what if there are no monetary values, an internal employment dispute, for example, is it just as useful? Presumably, yes, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, it just depends on what the alternatives are for resolving a dispute, right? So if, again, it's up to the mediator to know, let me see if I can find something that we've done in that area.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
If I could just go through the 2, because as I said, we are running a bit out of time. The answer is yes, you can do it. It was an interesting question. Are there any plans to run customized simulation on the platform for training, but for mediation training purposes? Gosh, I can see a great use there in people who are new to mediation, who are being trained in mediation.
And Bob, and I can't be shy, Bob. We would love to have ICODR members available to do some simulations if you want to try out anything. Or so what are your thoughts on that?
That is definitely, yeah, sure.
Well, that's a positive.
Not a problem. And just, you have my email address, and we can set up an appointment, and then we can do a little bit of training and put you on any one of you on the system, and then you can try it out.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. We'll have to bring this meeting to a close, but can I just mention this? I think there's been about, 7, 8 of these meetings every month, first Thursday. But it is a members group, and it's for you all as members. So if anybody's thinking, wow, it would be great to hear from such and such, or this company, or that you've heard of, because there's so much happening in this field all around the world, please get in touch with me or Colin, and we'll do our best, and we'll contact those people, because now, we're just working on the identity of the mystery speaker for next month, but we'll be able to send something out to you shortly. Again, it'll be the first Thursday. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Colin. Thank you,
and
Bob.
Please, Bob, a round of applause for Bob. Thank you so much for sharing your platform with us. And we'll post the recording soon. But thank you for all the great work, and keep it up. And Graham, thank you for serving as our capable MC today. You did a great job. So,
pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
All right. See you soon.
Okay.
Thank you for joining in. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.